the final version is to solve everything we did in previous versions where the community stated they disagreed. So this is a de minimis version. The initial version requested included many aspects, and finally this is a minimum what is included. I think we should be more restrictive, but finally, as an author of the proposal, I respect what the community has stated. So to summarize this rapidly, I think we're all aware of a mechanism that allows us to standardize the leasing. Leasing or subassignment is not allowed according to LAC-NIC's policies. So what we seek to do is to have a way that instead of this being uncontrolled and under the table, to still be under the control of LAC-NIC, as is the case of the final transfers. That is why I use this term. Ultimately, this is a way of looking at transfers, but instead of being transfers indefinitely until you retransfer the resources, these are temporary transfers. I think I can skip the justification. I think none of these are worth highlighting. Until version number 4, which I had done, and this sort of created some confusion, as was reported by one of the impact analysis, is that this led to confusion because in section 23218 it mixed temporary and permanent transfers and clarified which applied to one or the other. So I divided this into two sections, one exclusively for temporary transfers, which in fact is like a duplication of the permanent transfer text, but including the comments made by the community in order to reach consensus, hopefully. So what does this section state? That temporary IP4 address transfers will be allowed, that will be treated operationally as sub-assignments, because this has always been the case, although this hadn't been spelled out in the previous text. And compared to how the sub-assignments are defined and how the standard works today, these would not require connectivity with the infrastructure of the operator that leases or temporary transfers these addresses. An important fact is that I am considering this because this was requested by the community when we discussed the previous versions of this proposal. This is for temporary transfers in the region because the community, or at least this is how I understood it, stated that they didn't want resources to leave the region. So this is very important. Permanent transfers might involve transfers within the region or with other regions. The minimum size of the block that can be transferred is exactly the same as the one of permanent transfers, which is a /24, quite obviously, because otherwise routing of something smaller would be impossible. There was never discussion on this point, and I think this was the case in the previous one. Nobody had said that this type of leasing should be allowed with other regions. That discussion did not take place at all. So for an entity within LAC-NIC, maybe the benefit from this transfer, it must first go through a simplified justification process. So the need has to be justified instead of having pre-established criteria equal for all, because not all cases will be exactly the same. It should be important that LAC-NIC should decide how this should be done. It could be based on the current criteria. It could be more restrictive. But this is exactly the same as what happens with a permanent transfer. Ultimately, it is LAC-NIC that verifies this to justify the need and to enable that transfer. Quite obviously, LAC-NIC will have to verify that the holder of the resources is transferring these resources, as with the permanent transfers. And what I highlight is that although LAC-NIC doesn't supervise this, they have documentation of that transfer In previous versions, I requested LACNIC to review the contract, but LACNIC receives a signed copy of the document so that there is a justification and evidence that in fact the two sides agree. Without going into the content of what has been agreed, but just complying with this policy, LACNIC will maintain a log of temporary transfers that is publicly accessible, and in previous versions, specific data were requested of that log. But I think that following one of the comments received from the impact analysis and by the community is that the requested log was too complete. So we leave the decision in the hands of LACNIC to decide what is necessary for the proper operation and for the proper transparency of these operations.
The source entity of that transfer will be ineligible for allocation and assignment of IPv4 resources. That is logical, is what we have for permanent transfers as well. That is, if someone is transferring resources, it's because they have a surplus and they don't need it. So it wouldn't make sense that they go on a wait list waiting for more resources. That made no sense. The entity transferring and receiving will be subject to membership policies and they must have signed a service agreement. The one offering the addresses has already signed that contract. The other one, if they have an SAN or other LACNIC resources, has probably signed it. But if they had not, it is important they do, so they are also subject to current policies. So even though the original recipient of those addresses, and that is also a difference from other versions, the entity responsible is the one originally assigned by LACNIC, because this is a sub-assignment or sublease. It's important that both parties have signed the membership agreement. The addresses coming from LACNIC assessments cannot be subject to total or partial transfers for a period of 3 years. That is a safeguard. Someone who receives resources because they are in a wait list, if they are allocated resources, it's because they need it, but they cannot lease them or sublet them immediately after receiving them. And finally, the recipient of a temporary transfer, and also this is very important, cannot in turn make any subsequent transfers. So if I receive a series of addresses, I cannot sublet them to somebody else. That would mean I am doing business with this sub allocation. I think this is a safeguard and this is very important. There are different parts of the texts that we have discussed in the past, and I believe that we've reached a situation in where, well, I don't know if there will be further objections, but I think I have solved the objections in the past. Well, this part has not changed from previous versions. And finally, what I've tried to do in these last couple of slides are to address the objections. The chairs did a great work. I had sent this presentation before, but the objections that were raised in previous sessions, I just wanted to, well, at least I believe I want to show that they have been resolved. So we eliminate the maximum size of the transfer because there will be a justification for it. So what is the size being justified? We simplify the need justification. It's not a full justification for a temporary transfer, but we will allow the staff to decide how to organize it. So we are going to keep the same term of 3 years for transfers, so we deter the business, the subletting business. I've always been against all type of transfers, but the community needs them and we need to standardize it. But that's the main idea. We should deter abuse to receive addresses through transfers that are justified by a certain need. So these are not subsequently transferred again. So the entities that participate in temporary transfers are subject to LACNIC policies if they were not in the past, although the responsibility lies on those who were originally allocated those by LACNIC. And all the suggestions about eliminating any barriers or justifications that were not needed, like IPv6 prefix, deployment, or ASN. Those have been eliminated, and I think that's the last one. Thank you, Jordi. So this proposal does not yet have an impact assessment, so we will proceed to questions. So anyone in the room, please come to the mic for your opinions or comments. Also on Zoom, there's the Q&A button. Please let us know your name, organization, and what is your position regarding the proposal. Although there's no impact assessment, I've tried to, well, compare the past impact assessments, and I would understand, and maybe the staff can confirm, that everything that's been said so far has been addressed and corrected. But that is my opinion again. Okay, so let's start with the discussion. Rediani? Hello. Fernando Frediani. With regards to this proposal, I believe that the name temporary transfers is that I believe there should be a beginning and an end to it. That's why it's temporary. Anything that is temporary will come to an end. So this has been discussed in the list several times. We did raise the concern that there is no end date. So if there is no end date, I don't think we can call it a temporary transfer in this proposal. I think that this proposal should be a tool to help smaller entities to establish and then go ahead and have what is actually more accurate, a permanent transfer. If someone supports this indefinitely, it's not temporary anymore. And I want to stress that. And that's why I am against the proposal. There is no limit to the maximum number before that an organization can receive. And so if the proposal wants to be a temporary tool for smaller entities to establish, there should be thresholds to avoid misuse and abuse. So smaller ones can receive blocks like a /21 for a cash flow and have a subsequent permanent transfer to stay competitive. Minimally competitive, but there should be a limit, there should be a cap. So those who are not committed to the best practices in our system, starting with the IPv6 deployment, will continue to make temporary transfers one after the next, and that will not actually be temporary. And my second point, what's positive about the proposal, is that the source entity cannot receive further allocations or assignments for 1 year. I think that is positive to prevent those abuses. But against it is that there is no maximum or cap to the block size and that there is no stated end date. Actually, I was the first one to be against this type of proposal. And I am the first to say that there should be an end date. But the community has spoken and they do not agree. I'm actually an editor of a proposal rather than the author. And I think that I have to meet the demands of the community, or what I believe the community is asking, as my interpretation goes. And as you know, and we could read the text in that past slide, the final objective is the deployment of IPv6. I understand that someone can request a block based on the size of the network, in the deployment of the network, or whatever. I think that could happen, and that has happened. Someone that might need a transfer for 6 months, or maybe they run out of time and they will need 6 more months. I think that that can be renewed, and that does make sense. In the manual, it says that maybe we could ask for resources for 1 year and then renew it after that. I think it is important that we have wiggle room, and to to adapt to what the community wants. We might be misinterpreting what the community is saying. I don't know. Let's hear from other participants as well. Go ahead. Thank you, Jordi. Good morning. Andres Cortez from Costa Rica, municipality of Carrillo. 3 years ago, we embarked in an IPv6 transition period. We have resources. We are part of LACNIC's list for the configuration of our autonomous system. We needed to lease a pool from Afrinic, and that led to headaches due to geo-localization and what Jordi is trying to standardize. I feel that that would have been a great alternative for us if that had been standardized at the time, so not to breach the conditions or the policies that are currently in place. And the fact that they are temporary, sometimes when you are managing IT resources, you might take a chance in trying to do it in 3 years, and maybe the topic on the list might be resolved and I will not longer need that pool because I have mine, or the deadline is up and I could evaluate the possibility of embarking in that process for a permanent transfer. So I believe that these mechanisms allows for further versatility and to address a real need that we have in our countries in LATAM. And as a local government, a local agency, I would dare to say that we were the first ones to embark in this transition process. So I think this could be a great solution for us, the problem that we're currently facing. So if the next policy is approved, in the fact that we are giving priority in the list to be given our own pool, I would agree with the proposal. Yes, well, this type of proposal, I failed to mention it before, is to cover the back of the smaller ones. Because the big ones, of course, have financial resources for permanent transfers. And then if they have a surplus in resources, they'll evaluate whether to retransfer them or not. But in this case, what we're trying to do is support those who do not have the financial resources to pay for a permanent transfer. And this is, as the title states, a temporary solution. Of course, if you receive the resources from the list, you will no longer need to renew that temporary transfer. Ivan Morales from Guatemala. I agree with the proposal. In fact, I participated in the list, and I wanted to comment that in Guatemala, for example, we have around 600 ISPs that are surviving with 1 to 5 IPs allocated by their vendors, so those who already have resources. So surviving by having 5,000, 10,000 users with 1, 2, 3 IPs, well, that would be impossible. So I think this would be very much positive, and we cannot cover the sun with one finger. It is happening. Um, I personally agree. Thank you, Ivan. So Fernando, we are going to allow for those who have not participated yet to go first. So Franco, and then back to you. So there's a comment, questions from Henry Alex de Godoy, and I will read it in Portuguese. How could LACNIC make sure that the blocks that are transferred under this policy are applied on IPv6 only, like 464X LAC, and not used for expanding NAT 444, with making sure that they use these resources to apply the transition mechanisms? I do not agree with the proposal as is. Henry, you know that for me, we should uh, force these resources being used on 464X land, but the community does not want that commitment. You have said it yourself. There is no way of checking that implementation is being done. I do not agree with you on that. There's a way of checking if the implementation is being done, but if most voices are saying that we cannot demand an SAM from LACNIC or an IPv6 prefix or IPv6 deployment, I do not have any other options to move the proposal forward to reach consensus than eliminating what the majority is saying. This is not about majorities, but most of you are saying that we could not have those obstacles in place. I understand that it's a matter of logic. Those who are requesting these resources will use it for that. But what the community does not want, or at least that's what I understand, we cannot force it or demand it and use it as an obligation. But we will look at the next proposal where we discuss this.
Fernando, these are comments on the topic of the final date. I personally don't manage to understand the difficulty of having a final date in order to comply with the fact that the person who sub-assigned the resources to a third party. I see there's no issue with renewing this if this is necessary and is justified, but this should be publicly specified, saying I renewed this once again. I see there's no operational difficulty there for LACNIC or for the owner of the resources. I think this is something that is quite small, and it would be more consistent. But the critical thing which could lead to abuse is that there is no limitation regarding the amount of resources that can be transferred. I think that we establish a limit that would be better and would provide a limitation to abuse. Of course, this might affect transfers from those who are donating these and those who are receiving this, but this is so that the companies, persons, and organizations could permanently transfer the blocks, and also this would not encourage this practice so that it gets out of control, so that costs are increased, and feel very comfortable leasing this, because I think from my point of view is always bad. Fernando, once again, I agree with what you say. I prefer to have dates, to have deadlines, to publish this, to know this in advance. But operationally, this is a community. This is how the community has stated, and I adjust myself to what the community has said, because what we ultimately seek to achieve with the proposals is consensus. It's not. It's like I, as an author, want it to occur. I want to do it as is approved by the community through the consensus. Nico. Nicolas Antoniello, I speak on a personal note. I am against this proposal because the way as it is, and I have a couple of questions, Jordi, because the reality is that it's not mapped out there. I think that the reality is totally different from what we have over there. My first question is, in the event of the brokers, who are the ones who normally do these sub-assignments, how would this work in the terms of the contract? The brokers have the contract to the lessee. It's not the RIR. There are two intermediate contracts. It's like chaotic. If you wish to apply it as it is being proposed here, this would be quite chaotic and impossible. That's one point. Secondly, how would LACNIC control all that? LACNIC should become like a law enforcement, like a police, and we start to check who is doing these sub-assignments without having any commercial activity. And once this is detected, what do you do? Are you going to revoke all the resources to those who did the sub-assignments, because the sub-assignment was done without having a commercial relation? And LACNIC will have to demonstrate this. They say, well, I do have. So I see that what we're trying to do is to sort of force things. I think that many things are yet missing, so that it is something that truly reflects the reality. Nico, in the previous versions, I sought to make LACNIC become more involved in the process, And we heard that LACNIC could not be involved in the contract. So what we're doing here is saying LACNIC should only receive a copy of the contract, regardless of there being an intermediary. Someone has to give LACNIC a copy of the contract, showing that both sides agree on the contract. LACNIC doesn't verify the conditions of the contract, similar to what has been requested in previous versions, but at least there should be evidence, because if any of the parties disappears, they know how to proceed. I agree, Jordi, but you say here it has to be a copy of the contract with the LIR that has the contract with LACNIC and the person who receives the transfer. And this hardly ever occurs, because the contract is done between the broker and the others, and the broker has no contract with LACNIC. As far as I'm aware, the broker is an intermediary, but the contract is signed by the two sides. But if that is the case, I think this would be a change, and we could adjust this in the last call for comments, but we're not changing what we seek to have, which is verifying the contract. Jordi, let us continue the discussion in the mailing list. We encourage you to continue with the discussion in the mailing list. If there are no new comments, no more comments from the room, all right. So let us now start with measuring the temperature in the room. Thank you, Jordi. We asked LACNIC staff to assist us in counting the hands, and let us start with a poll on the Zoom.
Aquellas personas que están
Who is in favor of the proposal? A show of hands, please. And keep your hands raised. Thank you. Those who are against the proposal, please raise your hand.
Manténgala así unos segundos más. Los que están en contra, reitero. Ok, ¿pueden bajar? Y ahora sí, las personas que se abstienen, levanten la mano, por favor. Y la mantienen así unos segundos.
Those who abstain, please raise your hand and keep your hands raised, please.
Pueden bajarlo.
Thank you. So the proposal LAC-2023-7 temporary transfers version 5 finishes the discussion list on October the 9th, 2025, tomorrow. So as from tomorrow, this is closed, and for the coming 2 weeks, the moderators will communicate to the community whether this proposal has reached consensus or not. We still have time. We now have the ASO-NRO report. We're going to ask Ricardo Patara and Jorge Villa